English translation 709th Contact. Part 1 Sunday, the 29th of July 2018, 1:41 hours.
Greetings and welcome to you both, you Ptaah and also you Quetzal. Nice to see you, and besides, I have some questions and things to discuss, which is why I think our meeting today should be an official conversation, which I will then retrieve and also write down.
Thanks for your welcome and greeting, Edward. I also greet you, my friend, and I think it will be too early for you to work on the computer again. But if you allow and want, I would like to hear from you what happened to your detriment. Because during my last 3 short visits, the few remarks were not enough to be able to exchange the necessary information, because we mainly had to discuss the various work that had to be done in the field. There was also no discussion between Ptaah and I about what had happened to you, which is why I would now like to be informed in detail by you, if you will allow me. I also have the need to know a little more because you were, as usual, sparing with further details, as is always the case when it comes to your personality and your concerns. But I would like to know whether you want to work on the computer again, because I think that will still be questionable after your serious accident, and also when, through your own steady efforts, you are able to use your arm and hand again in a way that is extremely astonishing to me, because the injury you suffered was and is undeniably of a more serious nature than you consider it to be.
I know that, and to that I can say up front that from what the assistant surgeon had explained to me, I could not have made any other decision but to turn down an operation, because with only a 30% chance of surviving the operation, the decision was unquestionably clear to me.
You already told me that the other day during one of my visits, which is why I think your decision was also correct not to consent to surgery because you reasonably assessed the risks explained to you correctly and could not advocate surgical intervention.
Exactly. But if I have to, I want to take up and tell the whole thing in a little more detail from the beginning, although that will take some time. But now I would like to take up some other things first, which seem more important to me.
We are not in a hurry, and we can also talk about it later.
So then I want to raise some of my concerns first.
You can, of course, but before you talk about anything else, I urge you to be aware that there are new machinations afoot to create a new worldwide controversy about you and your work. This is being done underhandedly in a manner of alleged scientific investigation and research to misleadingly give the whole thing a serious appearance in an attempt once again to smear your photographic and film material produced on our behalf regarding our flying apparatus, etc., as a fraudulent scheme. Efforts were also made to defame our joint contacts as lies and deception. However, as I suggested to you some time ago, you are not to get involved in any way whatsoever with regard to the photo and film material, and with regard to questions arising in connection with our contacts. If these are aimed at calling your honesty and our contacts into question, for the sake of your security, you should also make increased efforts again, because there are also signs in this respect that there is a renewed imponderability, which is why we will also make efforts to carry out increased surveillance, both with regard to your personality and to group members, in order to prevent perfidious offensives, if possible.
What you advised me to do, I have kept to and will also continue to do. And as far as the photos and the films are concerned, you can talk about them, speculate about them, deny them and slander them, as all the opponents and antagonists want, because I know what the truth is. Namely that I have not photographed any models, nor produced any other fakes, but have photographed your real beam ships and so on. Furthermore, and you also know this, original slides and negatives of photographs and films have long since ceased to exist, because on the one hand and have stolen and sold many originals, and I have only been able to buy back poor copies of them, and that for 10 marks each. This, while on the other hand, Schmid, who died in the late 1980s, also cheated me, as did, and who both earned a lot of money by selling the originals. Schmid, who was trained as a photographer, also faked hundreds of slides and negatives, as well as films in various ways, and made new, original slides from them, which he then returned to me as real originals. In the end, you also checked all the slides and negatives yourself, and found that I had only received forgeries back, so that today I do not even have a single original.
That is indeed the case, because also the slides marked as originals by Schmid correspond to forgeries that he had forged under threats. He did it, as you know, not maliciously, but because he was massively forced to do so by the U.S. intelligence agents of the they were also the ones who then comprehensively commandeered all the original slides.
But I would be interested to know what happened to these originals. You yourselves also only made copies of my first original photos, so you still have the unaltered photos.
The original slides, which were requisitioned from Schmid by the Secret Service agents, had already disappeared from the archives of the after 11 months and could no longer be found. They had, as you like to say, disappeared without a trace, gone untraceable, and have since been lost, as if blown away by the wind, whereby also our inquiries did not lead to their being found again.
Which is also what happened to various film and photographic material of the supposedly first but imaginary moon landing of the USA moon mission.
That is correct, but we do not want to talk about that now, but about what your concerns are that you want to bring up first.
Of course. But first I would like to ask a question about the following newspaper article, because in Germany the Reich citizens movement problem is once again on the rise. After an incident in the middle Franconian town of Georgensgmund in Germany on the 19th of October 2016, you spoke of well over 14,000 Reich citizens, exact number was 14,791, who existed in Germany. Now the number of Reich citizens has drastically increased, as announced by the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution.
Office for the Protection of the Constitution, Reichsbürger Movement, has around 18,000 followers. Epoch Times, the 29th of April, 2018, 11:22.
The Constitutional Protection Authorities classify 18,000 human beings as followers of the so-called Reichsbürger movement. The Reich citizens are seen fragmented into small groups that do not recognize the Federal Republic, its institutions and laws. For many of them, the German Reich continues to exist within the borders of 1937. About 950 of them are considered by the authorities to be right-wing extremists. As a spokesperson for the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, BFV, told the Tagesspiegel Sunday edition. In the BFV annual report for 2016, there was still talk of 10,000 Reich citizens, with 500 to 600 right-wing extremists. However, the increase in numbers does not mean that the scene has also grown to the same extent. The BFV spokesperson said that the increase was mainly due to the fact that the Constitutional Protection Authorities had succeeded in further elucidating the spectrum. In 2016, the Federal Office intensified its observation of the scene together with the state authorities. The reason for this were serious acts of violence. The militancy and armament of many Reich citizens is a cause of concern for the authorities. The BFE spokesman said that about 1,200 Reich citizens still had legal weapons permits. Since the beginning of 2017, with the help of the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, it has been possible to revoke the permits of 450 Reich citizens. AFP source www.epochtimes. .dto 000 anhanger A241269 _._html.
Constitutional Protection Report. Reich citizens hostile to the state and extremist and ready for most serious acts of violence. Epoch Times, the 24th of July, 2018, 7:43.
The number of Reichsbürger and self-governors has risen sharply in the past year. They are classified as anti-state and extremist. Reichsbürger sometimes return their German identity cards and passports. The number of Reichsbürger and self-governors has risen sharply in the past year. This is reported by Bill Tuesday edition, with reference to the Verfassungsschutzbericht 2017 Reihe, which will be presented today in Berlin by Federal Interior Minister Horst Seehofer, SAU, and the President of the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, BFV, Hans-Georg Maaßen. At the end of 2017, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution counted around 16,500 persons in this scene, 2016. 10,000 persons, 900 2016, 500 to 600, of whom were right-wing extremists, it says. 3/4 of the scene, 74%, is male and older than 40, according to the BFV. According to the BFV report, both groups, the Reichsbürger and Selbstverwalter, deny the existence of the Federal Republic of Germany and also reject the legal system. The members are therefore currently classified by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution as anti-state and extremists. According to the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, the scene is highly militant and, in addition to its verbal aggressiveness, also has a high affinity for weapons. According to an assessment by the security agency, both the Reichsbürger and the Selbstverwalter are prepared to use their weapons for the most serious acts of violence.
Since our last count, the number of 14,791 Reich citizens has increased to 27,622 within a short time due to various sensationalistic presentations of media, such as television, newspapers, and journals, regarding the events in Georgensgmund on the 19th of October 2016. The rapid increase in the number of new Reich citizens who emerged in Germany was thus animated on the one hand by the sensationalistic media reports, but on the other hand, also to a large extent by the false, untenable political and state leadership that was hostile to freedom and the will of the people. In addition to the number of Reich citizens, which has grown to 27,622, many of whom are afraid of repression by the state and are therefore only secretly inclined towards their Reich citizenship, a number of more than 83,000 women and men in Germany, who feel a close attachment to a Reich citizen following and favor their ideology, sympathize according to our investigations. What also emerges, however, is the fact that the number of Reich citizens and their supporters continues to increase, with in particular the dissatisfaction of German citizenship being the most important factor. Namely, the dissatisfaction with the federal government, with the federal chancellor being the main target of dislike and hatred, who is also responsible for the refugee welcome culture.
Thanks. Then things can only get worse. Namely, both with the dissatisfaction and with the hatred of the German federal government, and thus especially with regard to Chancellor Angela Merkel.
That will actually be the case.
The Reich citizens and neo-Nazis in Germany and Switzerland, etc., as well as various other groupings, in the form of autonomous groups and self-governors, etc., in many other countries, are in my opinion nothing else but right-wing terrorists, who equate their terror in their hatred of the state and idiocy pathologically stupid and dumb with free and being free as well as freedom, etc. The machinations of the neo-Nazis at the end of the 1970s, and then at the beginning of the 1980s by a group of Reich citizens also had an effect on us, that is to say the FIGU, something you Ptaah probably still remember. Just as Bernadette and I certainly do, because neo-Nazis and Reich citizens who had gone mad contacted us and thanked us for the fact that the FIGU would be on par with them. They came up with this crazy idea as a result of the association's name Free Community of Interest, because they were of the confused opinion that the term free was to be understood as autonomy, separated from the state. Consequently, the Free Community of Interest would be an autonomous group. We, of course, distance ourselves vehemently from this, and I have a particularly important word to say about it. Our association FIGU, that is to say the Free Universal Community of Interests, corresponds to an association based on the rule of law, which, like all FIGU association members, recognizes and follows Switzerland as a state, as well as its federal constitution and laws. The FIGU association and its members also recognize the historical facts in a consequent and comprehensive way. Thus, the existence of Switzerland as a state is in no way denied, the state not denigrated or negated, nor is the legitimacy of the basic laws called into question, because generally the decrees of the authorities and courts are accepted by the FIGU and its members. This also includes the necessary unavoidable state levies, such as taxes, etc. Thus, the FIGU Free Community of Interests is not based on an autonomous grouping, an autonomous state, or anything otherwise hostile to the state, and is also not willing to deviate from it. And this is and remains so, because the association FIGU preserves the free and the freedom in every righteous and legally state lawfully conforming and permitted way, which also its members in purely private capacity keep in such a way, which is by state law absolutely right. Thus, the FIGU association is integrated into the state of Switzerland, just as the association members are also included in the entire state order of Switzerland. The FIGU association does also not produce fantasy identity papers, etc., but only identity cards, etc., which are righteously only FIGU association related, just as in every respect only the money produced by the state is used as means of payment, and with it also the justified taxes are paid honestly, which contribute in every conceivable justified and necessary way to the preservation of the Swiss state. But as far as crazy autonomy groups are concerned, such as Reich citizens or individual autonomists, that is to say, individual autonomous persons or other elements, groups and self-governing lunatics, etc., that are hostile to state and order. There are such not only in the form of Reich citizens, etc., in Germany, but also in Switzerland, whereby these autonomists and self-governing, etc., do not adhere to laws and denigrate the state under the rule of law as a joke. In Switzerland, too, a movement is steadily growing in this respect, whereby it resembles the German Reich citizens. Switzerland is also only an association as proclaimed. In addition, the Swiss Reich citizen sympathizers keep in contact with each other on the internet, whereby they provide instructions on Facebook on how willing Reich citizens lunatics can deregister from the state and become human. In a YouTube video, a certain Heino Fankhauser even gives instructions on how he returned his person to the state with a declaration on oath, and since then only wants to be addressed as human being Heino. From then on, he has only put his thumbprint and name in lowercase under documents. Swiss Reich citizens also use all kinds of self-made ID cards and fictitious car number plates, and drive around Switzerland with them, whereby they even prescribe to the authorities and courts that they may only judge people, but not human beings. This is probably to say that only persons who are part of the Swiss state may be judged, but not Reich citizens, because only these would be human beings, and had therefore to be named as such. These Reich citizens also proclaim that police law is not to be negotiated as being above human rights. Well, the Reich citizenship phenomenon is also active in Austria, where the Austrian state deniers call themselves freemen or are known as supporters of the One People's Public Trust OPP, who claim that they could run the state, although it must be said that there are also OPPT supporters in Switzerland. However, Austria also has to deal with an organization which calls itself the International Common Law Court of Justice Vienna ICCJV, which in addition has relocated its center to Switzerland and wants to establish a general jurisdiction with human, natural and international rights which should have precedence over the federal constitution. Also, a so-called sheriff association belongs to the ICCJV, which is registered in the Swiss Commercial Register as an association, whereby these sheriffs are supposed to carry charged weapons open or concealed, which is meant for execution of court orders, as it can be read on the ICCJV website. In this way, the Swiss arms laws are not supposed to be valid. This means that the ICCJV is also active in Switzerland, whereby one of its founders is the Swiss entrepreneur Daniel Model, who generates annual sales of around CHF 600 million as a manufacturer of packaging. In 2006, he also founded his own state, which he named Avalon, and for which he built a massive stone building, the Modelhof, where among other things lectures are given and calls for illegitimacy and alternatives to the state monopoly on the use of G-Vault and on the exercise of legal power. Reich citizens are therefore not only a national, but also an international phenomenon, and this also exists in many other countries. For example, in Australia, as well as in Denmark, for example, Christiana, but also in France, England, Canada, in the USA, Russia, as well as in various other countries. For the term Reich citizens, there is actually no generally accepted definition, just as there is no uniform movement or ideology in this regard. Effectively, individual groups are in part at odds with each other because their anti-state ideologies differ. Their pathologically confused thought construct consists of diverse and in itself unlogical right-wing extremist, racist, religious, sectarian, and anti-Semitic or wordly irrational ideologies, conspiracy theories, or esoteric senselessnesses. One thing, however, all male and female supporters of such imbecilic ideologies have in common, namely that they do not recognize the regular and constitutionally created states. For they all claim that the effective constitutional state would not exist rightfully, and that the folks would only be exploited by these bogus states, whereby the Reich citizens of all kinds consistently ignore and deny the historical facts. In addition, they demarcate their homes, houses, and their land, whereby extreme Reich citizens elements do in their delusion not shy away from defending their Reich with armed Gewalt, and from thereby accepting the death of others. Well, I think that if the existence of the constitutional home state is denied by Reich citizens elements, then also the legitimacy of basic laws is denied, just as decisions by authorities and courts are not accepted, no taxes or other state duties are paid, nor any state duties are fulfilled. Reich citizens of each facet establish their own governments, monarchies, and introduce kings, Reich officials, or Reich military. In addition, they print and also spend their own money, for example the angel money in Saxony-Anhalt, just as they also issue fantasy papers such as passports, driving licenses, and ID cards, etc., and try to authenticate themselves with them in the regular constitutional state. In this regard there are quite strange tendencies, such as for example a self-proclaimed king of Germany who is called Peter Fitzek by his real name and acts crazy with his own Reich and with his own currency. But what I would now also like to say about Chancellor Merkel's lack of intelligence and irresponsibility with regard to the induced refugee welcome culture which has lasted to this day and will continue in further future, from which practically all EU dictatorship states, including Switzerland, have been infected. The entire situation is not just being perpetuated by criminal smugglers alone. As you have already said several times privately, irresponsible rulers of the countries of refuge are colluding with the smugglers, and thereby also taking money from the refugees who have to pay their smugglers. So it is not only the smugglers of refugees who are exploiting the refugees for own gain, but also the irresponsible rulers who work with the smugglers. The refugee welcome culture of Merkel is very welcome to the concerned rulers of the refugee states. As you said, because all the refugees who seek the way to Europe, many of whom die, no longer burden their homeland with unemployment, poverty, criminality, felony, and various other problems. Of course, the irresponsible rulers of the refugee states are happy about this, because on the one hand, they do not have to deal with these problems any more or much less, while on the other hand, they nevertheless still get paid by the hired smugglers and thus profit horrendously. This, however, is done by the irresponsible leaders of the refugee states, secretly hiring smugglers and also promoting the flight practice of those who are willing to flee, especially the young human beings who flee their homeland because it gets drummed into them that they would be very welcome in Europe and could live in joy and glory. With deceitful promises they are encouraged to flee to Europe, which is secretly and extensively promoted by the state in the refugee states. of which, however, the big-mouthed rulers affected by stupidity, megalomania, greed for power and imperiousness, and all the false humanistic refugee rescuers have no idea and no knowledge whatsoever. That is why they themselves, too, are in their ignorance, doing all they can to further promote the flow of refugees, and to make the smugglers and their irresponsible backers in the governments of the refugee countries, which become richer and richer, while on the other hand, many refugees who pay horrendous sums to the smugglers die on the arduous routes to Europe.
I have already spoken about this several times, but this has in fact only ever been in private, which is why it is probably good that you mention these facts at one point in an official conversation. Which I too could have done, but which was never the case, because other facts always had to be discussed. But as far as your computer work is concerned, I would like to say first that we will only have official conversations again when you no longer have any complaints, because with regard to your injury, overexertion is not advantageous. That must be enough if you retrieve and write down this conversation today. So we will keep everything the same as before. Just that we only visit you for short periods of time and only have conversations of a personal nature, which must be registered by us, but not called up by you and not recorded. Then you should now explain to Quetzal the facts concerning your accident, after which he will once again have to discuss a few things with you in the field. Whereby I also want to be present because I am interested in the work that has to be done, which he has to explain, and which is then to be done under your direction.
First of all, I want to say that I have been trying to work with the computer on and off for weeks. Admittedly, the whole thing is extremely painful, because every little wrong movement, which unfortunately happens again and again, makes me see the fire in Holland or the stars in infinity, as I also often type wrongly, because it is difficult to coordinate the hand and the fingers and the arm correctly due to the pain and the severely limited mobility. So it will take me quite some time to retrieve the interview report and write it down. However, the repetitive work and efforts on the computer have been successful, as have my personal therapy exercises. On the 20th of July, after another X-ray, even the head doctor at the hospital was surprised at the success of these exercises and explained that even if an operation had been performed, the whole thing would not have looked any better. This, he probably meant if I had survived the operation, but he did not say this openly. I would also like to clarify all the important matters concerning the group, which I have sent to you via Florina, so that you can work through them and also discuss them in detail in the committee. We have our regular General Assembly next weekend, at which I will have to present your decisions and advice.
To talk about it and to clarify everything, that is of course important, but Ptaah has to report on it, because that is his duty. So I will be patient and wait, because I am also interested in what else you have to bring up, to hear what you have to say afterwards regarding your accident.
What I have to explain on the part of the body in terms of advice and decisions regarding the FIGU guidelines and statutes, the FIGU premises and the concern of, and the related safety conditions, insurances and responsibility, etc., as well as in terms of and the related possibilities and impossibilities, etc., I will gladly explain before explaining your accident. Also, with regard to a FIGU site, free and freedom must also be upheld in this regard, as was stated earlier with regard to the forestation and use of FIGU land for non-FIGU purposes, as a result of which such a request had to be rejected by the General Assembly, as must equally be the case with regard to the request from.
You are explaining that the whole thing would be an outside use on FIGU property, as is the case with regard to forestry and supervision. Anyway, that's how I understand your elaboration.
You have understood correctly. But my explanations will also take some time, although you should not write them down, but only keep them in your mind and reproduce them verbally at the GV. Therefore, hear now what councils and resolutions have been passed by the board and are to be brought to bear, which, very strictly speaking, correspond to the guidelines of the Free Universal Interest Group, whereby the free is to be considered and understood in the strict sense that the free and the freedom of the FIGU, that is to say, Free Universal Interest Group, must be preserved in every case and in every way, and must also be spread in the world and preserved under all conceivable circumstances. The free and freedom applies to the FIGU Association and the missionary work, all other work and activities, as well as to the individual core group members and passive members, etc., in every conceivable respect, so that coercion and violence may never be demanded or exercised, but always and only the free, freisen, and freedom must be in the foreground and must be given without restriction in every case. This also means that all work to be done by FIGU members in the FIGU Association must be carried out in a voluntary or free manner and absolutely free of charge. Consequently, the freedom and freelessness of the FIGU Association also require that the free universal community of interests may not issue any membership or association-related employment contracts, just as no membership or association-related remuneration may be made in connection with employment contracts. According to the respective FIGU General Assembly resolution, work orders and work commitments requiring financial compensation may only be issued to self-employed workers, that is to say, to workers who are not FIGU members, and non-financial work order and work compensation may also be paid to them. Such external work orders and work commitments can, of course, also be issued to independent FIGU, external companies of FIGU members, and they can also be remunerated for the order and work compensation incurred. But now to the previously mentioned facts, advice, guidelines, and resolutions, the following explanations, whereby at the next General Assembly it should be made clear that the following should be rewritten and introduced into the statutes and bylaws. Now, what is to be explained in detail about everything, I will put into words as follows.
Thanks for your comments. Please pass on my thanks and those of the core group to the panel. The advice and decisions help us a lot, because with everything, things have now also become clearer that needed to be explained in more detail.
But there are other things, such as emergency procedures, which are not listed in the bylaws, but which the General Assembly will be confronted with soon, and which will then be acted upon.
Like what?
It will be about issues in Australia, namely, and you will have to take a stand on this, which will only be effective locally, but as before, will not be made public to the outside world, but will remain an emergency act.
All right, then the question? How do you play and assess sanctions that are taken and implemented against other states, as practiced in particular by the EU dictatorship in the USA against Russia?
Such action and doing is absurd and politically reprehensible.
Sanctions as a political weapon correspond to an attitude as sneaky, despicable, and degenerate as any kind of acts of war. If I may use your words, I would also like to say in this regard that political as well as other sanctions are stupid, primitive, and lunatic, and prove that the originators of such machinations are despotic, irresponsible elements who have a very horrendous lack of intellect, rationality, and intelligence, and thus also of a real, healthy, and righteous way in terms of a capacity for governing. Also, punitive tariffs as a political weapon against trade goods of foreign states, as imposed by Trump on various states, who is unfit for the office of U.S. President and should be removed from office, correspond to a primitive, intellectually deficient, irrational, and intelligence-poor way of acting and reprehensible reprisals. It has been proved since time immemorial that sanctions of any kind, so also punitive tariffs, etc., have never been a means of settling any differences between different states or even of bringing about good understanding and peace between them. On the contrary, through the fault of irresponsible contracting and megalomaniacal rulers and governors, only increased rejection, discord, difficulties, trade wars, as well as hatred, revenge, and ultimately insurrectionary armies, acts of terrorism and wars among countries have resulted. However, these have always been fought not by the fallible female or male rulers, but by the populations and armies, who have provoked wars through the delusion of power and the irresponsibility of the people in power and their high-handedness. And since the peoples and the armies never stood up to the government criminal and completely irresponsible and criminal machinations of the rulers of every kind, and did not refuse to take up arms and commit war murder, the whole thing has been maintained up to the present time and is being continued in an unchanged manner. And as long as the populations and armies of all countries do not refuse to engage in acts of war against alleged enemies, but on the contrary comply with the warmongering and peace-preventing activities of the ruling power-obsessed, and advocate and engage in acts of war, so long can no real peace and no effective freedom arise on earth and among all its humanity. What is the case in practically all states throughout the world at the present time, under the majority of inadequate, anti-peace and anti-people, conscienceless, irresponsible and power-obsessed leaderships of those in power in very many areas does not correspond in any way to any form of peace, freedom, and justice, either for them or for their populations. On the contrary, the whole thing corresponds only to a state of threat in the form of a dangerous and dubious tranquility which threatens to break at any moment and can lead to armed conflicts, wars, or at least to long-lasting hostile differences between the countries and thus also between the populations. And the fact that the populations, who in any case are always the ones who effectively suffer the most, howl along with the wolves of power of their governments, who conjure up everything evil and bad in the name of the peoples, results from the fact that the masses of the populations, as a result of their unconsciousness, lack of education, and inertia, are themselves incapable of questioning anything, of thinking for themselves, and of deciding and acting in the correct way. The fact is that the peoples, without being able to form their own rational and reasoned opinion, allow themselves to be lulled without hesitation by the suggestive lies, promises of lies and the like of all those fallible rulers, whereby these fallible rulers form the bulk of all rulers and co-rulers in all states of the earth, who create strife, discord, and lack of freedom, both in their own country and in other states. And as long as Earth humans continue to live in this weak state of consciousness and do not begin to think, consider, and act for themselves, but leave everything to the wrongly deciding, wrongly acting, and high-handed rulers, nothing will change for the better. The whole mass of Earth humans must at last find for themselves the right path to peace and freedom, first to themselves and then to the whole of Earth humans, as is shown, described and taught in many ways by the teaching of truth. Teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, in relation to the personal thinking, decision-making, and action of the individual with regard to action.
I can only agree with this and hope that your words will find their way into the ears, minds, and reason of Earthlings. But if that will really be the case, it will only be in the distant future, if the great catastrophe you have announced sweeps away the majority of Earthlings. Unfortunately, it will be the case that the majority of Earth humans will continue not to learn the effective truth of life and existence, but will continue to vegetate thoughtlessly and want to err with regard to real reality for as long as they live. Hence, it will also be that the majority of human beings on Earth will continue to cheer and emulate all those erroneous and confused suggestive speeches, lies, deceptions, and false promises of the autocratic, government-unfit, irresponsible rulers. In the process, everything lying and criminal is also done to suppress and deny the real, effective reality and its truth, which could and would lead to a change for the good and the best, and into a future of effective worldwide peace, true freedom, and justice. Of course, I do not only mean the teaching of Nocodemian, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, which is spread by the Figu Association and myself, but also any other good and correct teaching of any Earthlings who have gained their own truthful knowledge concerning life, the environment, existence, the universe, consciousness, spirit, energy, mind, reason, and intelligence, as well as especially the relevant human behavior, and who spread their valuable knowledge among the human beings of the earth. And it is indeed the case that many earthlings have since time immemorial repeatedly gained and spread good, positive and valuable knowledge, also with regard to spiritual teachings, but as a result of the ignorance of the peoples and their oppression by the rulers of the religions and sects as well as rulers and state powers, not much of it could really penetrate, and therefore bring about only a few positive changes. This is also true of all that is good, correct and true, which is undoubtedly also taught in many different religions and sects, etc. Although all religious sectarian posturing is excluded from real reality and its truth, in particular all the nonsense of imaginary forms, such as a god or deities, a son of God, divine prophets, divine saints, angels and devils, etc. But what I want to say about what you have said about sanctions and punitive tariffs is that I share your view about punitive tariffs. When such tariffs are levied on trade goods, as the U.S. ruler or the crazy lying presidential oaf Trump is doing against other states with regard to various trade goods, then the trade exchange economy is disadvantaged. By imbecilically levying punitive tariffs, certain trade goods are made much more expensive, just as business people and consumers are also exploited by punitive tariffs levied by government-incapable pathological imbeciles, which amounts to a sheer irresponsible act of terrorism. And the fact that the oaf Trump, whose orders, actions, deeds, speeches and governance correspond to those of a 6-year-old boy, is of course completely indifferent, and that with his idiotic actions and deeds he is also working against his own country. That is to say, the USA is creating enmity in various states, is something that he does not understand and, in his weakness of intelligence, is also unable to grasp, as are his advisors and all the others in his circle of government and the supporters from the people of the USA who support him. For my part, I have thought about this pompous and undignified guy, whereby I assess him in such a way that he is on the one hand megalomaniac and on the other hand domineering, as it is written in the dictionary. Furthermore, I can recognize in his whole behavior and conduct a serious defect of mind, reason and intelligence, although I cannot ascertain whether this defect of consciousness, coupled with a certain amount of imbecility, is congenital or whether he acquired it himself in his early childhood or adolescence as a result of his great stupidity and emotional disability. His intelligence defect, which is clearly evident to me, and his inconsistency with regard to his own statements and instructions, etc., also reveal his absurd and foolish behavior, as well as his fickleness and lying, as well as his constant changing and revoking of given instructions, and the respective thoughtless, vehement, and quick denial of negative facts which are made known about him, his behavior, actions, and deeds. In my opinion, this man is dominated by an obsession with himself, as well as by a cognitive distortion of his personality and an overestimation of his own skills and competencies. As is unfortunately the case worldwide with many female and male government leaders of all colors, he is an element of extreme form in terms of almost boundless self-overestimation, self-congratulation, self-aggrandizement, and even self-glorification, which is particularly expressed when he signs decrees, etc., and provocatively raises them in the presence of a large group of people who admire him and demonstratively exposes them for the spectators and journalists. For me, however, a loss of reality is also recognizable. And in addition, everything is also characterized in such a way that I would like to call it hubris, a self-conceit, presumption and haughtiness, arrogance and presumptuousness. The whole of Trump's personality is also connected to a loss of reality in that he has overestimated his own abilities, achievements and competencies, as is usually the case with persons who hold positions of power, especially in government positions, but also in positions of civil servants and superiors, although these human beings, including Trump, are not aware of this fact. Such persons can also be found among all kinds of other potentates. That is to say, rulers, leaders, spokespersons, territorial leaders, regents, chiefs, headmen, commanders, holders of power, holders of authority, country leaders, bosses, commanders, and emperors. The elements falling into this round dance live under a delusion in which they believe themselves to be a very important personality, and in this way are addicted to gigantomania and megalomania, but they also live under the delusion that they must and would surpass their fellow human beings in their striving for and acting in power by exaggerated achievements, which is not usually the case because such persons turn out to be rather human rivets and zeros.
You have had good training and learnt much from my father Svath, dear friend, which is why you are well versed in psychoanalysis. Therefore, you judge and call this man's conduct, mind, reason, and intelligence in a correct manner, namely that there is a certain pathological imbecility in him, that is to say, a consciousness-related disability in the form of a persistent state of clearly below-average cognitive abilities, as well as associated limitations in his affective behavior, which is predominantly determined by short, impulse-like emotional impulses and not by cognitive processes.
Thanks for your opinion, but I do not want to shine with what I have learnt of this kind with Svath, which is why I basically hold back in this regard towards the human beings of Earth, and do not bring up such things. Maybe it will be good if I just leave out what was said when I recall and transcribe the conversation and just make a few dots.
No, you should not, because your psychoanalytical assessment gets to the heart of what needs to be said about Donald Trump as an assessment.
That is also my opinion. Because this man is not only stupid and incapable as a leader, but also uneducated and absolutely unpredictable in his megalomania, self-importance, and half-baked mind and lack of reason. As I have studied the practices of the U.S. presidents and still deal with them today, I can only say that degenerations of character, lack of understanding and reason, as well as illogical, low and primitive forms, as well as underhanded hostility, strife, and war-making degenerations, such as are peculiar to Trump, were also inherent in other U.S. presidents in a different way. An undeniable fact, which often led to wars, political assassinations, government overthrows in foreign states, as well as many other serious monstrosities being triggered and carried out by the U.S. government. U.S. intelligence services and U.S. military, which also gave rise to terrorist organizations, such as Al-Qaeda and the IS or Islamist State, through the fault of U.S. policy and its machinations. And all this has been happening since time immemorial, since the United States of America has existed, because the majority of all politicians and government officials, as well as their presidents, have been power-obsessed and completely irresponsible elements since the beginning of the USA. As such, they were, and Trump is also, unrestrainedly addicted to amorality, malice, and unconscionability, as well as an uncontrollable lack of restraint, indecency, irresponsibility, nefariousness, mindlessness, ruthlessness, and unscrupulousness. This also lacks any honesty, order, any sense of peace, freedom, and righteousness. However, if I take the floor now, I must now return to what Ptaah raised regarding a new controversy, as well as the possibility of new perfidious offensives against you, and possibly the core group members. Because I am responsible for making security efforts and working out certain security measures, which we keep under control according to our directives with permitted means. We will make every effort to do what is necessary, and we will also do it in the future as long as it is necessary. Certain precautions to be carried out I will now explain to you, whereby there are also things to be done in the center compound, which are to be carried out, after which I will then check the corresponding executions in due course. However, this is not to be discussed openly, neither now nor later, and thus nothing is to be recorded by you in writing, for measures are to be observed that will be of great importance, namely with regard to the possibility. Therefore, these are to be carried out from today until 3 weeks at the latest, namely, furthermore, the following further measures such as are also to be taken, which unfortunately, it is unavoidable that, because threatening attacks must be expected again, whereby which must be prevented. So appropriate precautions have to be taken, which give a certain security that already attempts of attack will be prevented. Therefore,
if with these precautions to be taken by us and with your various efforts mentioned by you with regard to, then it should really be with besides.
That can be assumed. However, The reason why this new controversy is being sought is based on two important factors, namely, firstly, the maliciousness of fighting against that which generally brings personal progress to Earth humans with regard to becoming truly human, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life. This teaching, however, is prevented by all means of lies, deceit, and slander, mainly by the leaders and believers of religions and sects, but also by politics, and thus also by secret governmental machinations. The teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, which you bring, teach and spread, and which can indisputably bring to Earth humans their very own life according to positive creational laws, as well as real interpersonal peace and freedom and thus good interpersonal relationships, is the most valuable teaching ever brought and taught to Earth for the revolution of consciousness in relation to true humanity, and is now being taught anew. It was indeed brought and taught in ancient times, but it was maliciously falsified by misunderstanding Earth humans, and false religions and sects were created from it, from which a great deal of evil and mischief has been produced up to the present time. Unfortunately, this will also continue to be the case in the far future, because the malicious power of the religions, sects, and their representatives, who may be believers, but are nevertheless irresponsible, continue to vehemently promote the fanaticism-induced faith of the sanctimonious, uncritical, naive, and clueless followers of the faith. Thereby, through suggestive influencing powers of faith-promoting elements of various kinds, helpless faith-label persons, who are searching for real truth of life and for a real expansion of their consciousness, are unhesitatingly and irresponsibly seduced into new believers and driven into religious and sectarian fanaticism and delusion. The second malignant factor in the new controversy being sought is to nip in the bud your and the Figus and their members' efforts in relation to the disastrous consequences of overpopulation and to slander them as lies, conspiracy theories, nonsense, fantasy, and do-gooder theories. There are already corresponding activities and defamatory undertakings in this regard, which are intended to prevent your open dissemination of the truth, and thus also to name the truth of the actual causes of climate change, the destruction of nature, fauna, and flora, and of the planet itself. So the irresponsible machinations of excessive overpopulation are to be concealed or at least trivialized, which are to blame for all the natural catastrophes, destructions, and the death of many Earth humans that are already occurring worldwide and are steadily getting worse and worse. But this also obscures and even deliberately prevents the truth that all planetary reasonableness with regard to a human population that is ideally sustainable for the Earth has long since been exceeded by a factor of 16. Furthermore, it is also concealed because it is not to be recognized and also not to be known that the unstoppably increasing brutality, violence, indifference, lack of conscience, the murdering, killing, terrorizing, the compulsions and the warfare, as well as the entire criminality and the criminal system in the entire earthly humanity are constantly increasing and becoming more precarious and degenerating more and more. Already in the families, through wrong and miseducation, the causes begin to form, to shape the offspring for all kinds of degenerations, which ultimately also bring malicious negative effects on the environment, nature, its fauna and flora, and the planet itself. And in this respect, everything increases and worsens in such a way that the wrongly and miseducated offspring themselves also carelessly produce and bring into the world offspring who then, also like their parents, in relation to the real reality and truth, with their degenerating, criminal, and felonious machinations, also ruthlessly bring death, extinction, destruction, and annihilation in nature, fauna, and flora, and also promote them more and more. Furthermore, it is a given that organized groups hostile to order, peace, and freedom, and also elements acting in the governments, are creating new challenges and divergences, with lies, deceit, defamatory hostilities, hatred, envy and speculation, and contradictions based on paradoxes, as well as all kinds of malicious machinations, are intended to mislead Earth humans, thereby impairing their intellect and reason and preventing human beings from creating peace and freedom within themselves and between peoples. Basically, Earth humans should not find the way to real reality and truth, because only by being beguiled in their entire mass by lies, deceit, violence, and coercion, which is especially the case through the suggestive whisperings of faith by those in power, rulers and leaders of religions and sects, but also by the falseness and self-importance of the fallible leaders of power in politics, the Earth humans can be enchantingly easily directed as the bulk of the masses, held down and kept under control in religious, sectarian, and political expediency. In this way, Earth humans have been directed, ruled, governed, persuaded and commanded, kept under supervision and monitored by the majority of rulers and representatives of religions, sects, and politicians and ruling powers of all colors since time immemorial. In the process, everything that has kept the power of the religions and sects, respectively their rulers and representatives, as well as the politicians, rulers, and those in power alive, and also continues to keep them alive, has been surreptitiously promoted with all malicious lies, false promises, and machinations. And this has been able to happen since time immemorial, as it is also the case today, because the peoples, on the one hand, do not free themselves from their religious, sectarian delusion and do not turn to the real reality and truth, and not to the fact that they themselves alone are and possess that power and might, through which they make every decision themselves and carry out every action on their own responsibility, and likewise perform every deed according to their own will, and that without a deity doing this for them or being able to do so, because all deities correspond to nothing other than morbid, stupid imaginings of the believers. On the other hand, the same principle applies in a modified way to politics, rulers and governors, etc., because the peoples themselves usually elect their rulers, leaders and rulers, so that they are also responsible for what their elected rulers do, how they act, govern, and thus exercise their governmental office and power potential as a whole. In this way, however, it has been the case from time immemorial that the peoples, in their ignorance and lack of knowledge of human nature, etc., and without knowledge of human nature, etc., elected and acclaimed their rulers, state leaders and rulers, without recognizing their intentions. Consequently, in every case, only urge, violence and coercion resulted from everything, as is also still the case, because the people, in their stupidity, lack of knowledge of human nature and ignorance, elect the wrong persons to positions of government and power. After that, discontent, strife, and finally uprisings and acts of violence arise from the whole thing, from which the peoples then have to suffer. Whereby, however, they themselves have elected their oppressive rulers and brought them into their positions, to which you once said in a comparison that stupid calves choose their butchers themselves. Through all that I have explained so far, it is absolutely impossible for individual Earth humans and for the whole of Earth humanity to find the way to peace, freedom, truth, justice, and to knowledge that is in accordance with reality, either intrinsically within themselves or within society and the mass of the whole of humanity. In fact, everything is to be prevented also with regard to good interpersonal relations, as well as with regard to peace and freedom in uniting friendships, deep relations, and between the different peoples among themselves. If peace and freedom were to come about in the Earth humans themselves, and thereby also in all peoples, then the religions would lose power among their believers, and their false teachings would become useless, because the believers would inevitably recognize that the Earth human being alone is master of himself, as well as of his thoughts, feelings, decisions, actions, and deeds, and not a god or other supposedly divine savior. Every political disunity, The non-thinking of the people, as well as the opinions propagated and suggested by the ruling rulers, must comprehensively take hold of the people and become their own. Consequently, they must be maintained by all means, and thus secure their positions for that part of the unrighteous rulers who act against the good of their peoples, harass them in many ways, and enrich themselves pecuniarily to their detriment, which leads to hatred and envy, etc. Hatred, envy, and slander have no expiry date when it comes to preventing something that is real, good, and valuable, such as the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life which you teach and spread, and through which love, peace, freedom, equality, and justice can arise in earth humans themselves and be spread throughout the entire earth population. To prevent the spread of this teaching, and thus your work and mission in this respect, is to be the purpose of the controversy, which is again to be brought into being by religious believers, envious people, know-it-alls, as well as by certain authoritative authorities and other adversaries throughout the world, namely by inventing untrue circumstances about you and accusing you of lies and deceitfulness through various machinations. So again, slander and falsehood shall arise that your film and photo material concerning our flying apparatus shall be forgery, swindling, charlatanry, swindling, and even maleficence. This, as before, is to be connected with malicious and insidious provocations of every conceivable kind in relation to your personality, especially attacks which could also endanger your safety again, but under certain circumstances also that of your family and the Figu Club members. So, malicious disparagement, belittling, ridiculing, denigrating, defaming, insulting, and discriminating will continue to take place. And in this regard, everything will be kept alive and continue until far into the future. Consequently, these intrigues will lead to a never-ending spiral full of untruths, and will be continuously preserved until far into the future. For our part, although we will endeavor to control all these defamatory and also threatening activities, etc., as far as possible, as decided by our committee, we cannot give any guarantee that certain attacks will fall outside our control. Furthermore, it must be explained that by spreading ever more intensely and extensively increasing and fanatically degenerating faith lies and faith deceptions by sectarian religious believers worldwide, earth humans are to be prevented from finding themselves and recognizing that it is not a God or any other higher power that has to decide on personal actions and deeds, etc., but only the human being alone in every way and manner. Thus, in the present and in the coming times, believers afflicted with religious delusion will again push up the old-fashioned lies and deceptions of faith with renewed efforts to drive earth humans once more into a religious faith, and thus into a state which, as in earlier times, can bring evil degenerations. Connected with this is also the addiction to power and the greed for profit of many rulers and business tycoons, etc., who irresponsibly know how to use the delusion of faith of countless earth humans and fanatize them, whereby in particular an increase in the readiness to use violence and the exercise of violence arises, which moreover also increases in relation to the unrestrainedly excessive growth of earth human overpopulation. And this readiness to use violence and violence of all kinds, which already begins with verbal violence in the upbringing of children, and in the course of life degenerates into physical and deadly violence, has for some time now been gaining the upper hand worldwide. The whole thing begins in the family and continues to spread throughout Earth human being society, especially in politics, in the actions of the security forces, the military, as well as in the actions of superiors, etc., and of course especially in religions and sects, where the violent powers of many religious representatives do not shy away from rape, threats, and much more evil. The mass of Earth human overpopulation has risen to almost 9 billion since your foreboding warnings to the rulers and media, etc., which you wrote worldwide in the 1940s and 1950s, when the Earth humans did not yet amount to 3 billion, whereby the factor of that has already been exceeded by which the steadily increasing readiness for violence and exercise of violence of the Earth humans could still be controlled and prevented. In fact, the future will show that the readiness to use violence and its exercise will continue to spread in an unimagined way and in many different forms throughout the entire society of all peoples, and will bring a great deal of suffering, death, disaster, and destruction, and will no longer be able to be contained. In this way, however, it will not only be the terrorist cells, which for decades have brought disaster and destruction as well as torture, massacres and many deaths, misery and hardship upon Earth humans, because everything of this kind is now inexorably spreading more and more. Therefore, it will increasingly be innumerable degenerate individuals, as well as elements of the normal bourgeois Earth population gathering together in small or larger groups, who will in future more frequently and brutally commit violence in public in an ever more unhesitating and uncontrolled manner. And indeed much worse than has been the case for years in increasing measure, with which fear, terror, suffering, distress, damage, and tribulation will be spread among many righteous Earth humans.